introducing today's speaker. I say privilege because I've known of Fisher, in the Baptist world for many years, and now I have the privilege of being a church member with him. He and I both go to the Baptist Church of the Covenant in Birmingham, Alabama. And I joined the church 3 years ago when I moved to Birmingham. And I had been there about 6 or 7 months when our pastor, Sarah Shelton, had to be gone for a Sunday, and Fisher filled in for her. And he gave absolutely the best sermon on Baptist and religious liberty I have ever heard. It was just a moving, stirring example of what we as Baptists can do when we speak out about our history. So Fisher, thank you for that. Fisher+Humphreys is the Professor of Divinity Emeritus of Samford+University, my university. He also serves as the residential scholar at St. Mary's on the Highlands Episcopal Church in Birmingham, and is chairman of the board of Christian Ethics Today. He was born in Columbus, Mississippi, and his wife, Carolyn Nan Toller Humphreys, and he had 2 children. Where's Caroline's back there? They have 3 granddaughters also. He got his Bachelor of Arts degree from Mississippi College, the Master of Arts degree from Loyola University, the Master of Letters degree from Oxford University, the Bachelor of Divinity and Doctoral of Theology degrees from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. He served pastor of several churches in Alabama, Louisiana, Illinois, Mississippi, taught Christian theology at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary and at Beeson+Divinity+School at Samford. Has written numerous books and articles, many of which I steer my students toward in those classes. So let's welcome Fisher+Humphreys.
I have a handout that I would like to distribute. And thank you. As you can see, I printed plenty of copies. Good. I want to express my appreciation to you all for having all of us who are theologians here this week. This has been a special event, I think, and I'm very pleased to have been a part of it. I have written 3 times more than I have time to say, and rather than talk 3 times faster than I should, I've got these outlines. I'm going to do about what I can do in about a half hour, and then I'm going to stop, and what I didn't get to, you're welcome to ask me to say something about those things, or we can just talk about the things that I did get to, whichever you like. The subject is Baptist theology, academic theology since 1950, but by that we certainly don't want to restrict ourselves to people whose ministry has been in higher education. Baptists have always had pastor theologians. In our period, they include people as different as W.A. Criswell, Harry Emerson Fosdick, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Piper. Across the centuries, the principal conversation partner for Christian theology has been philosophy. But sometimes theologians engage in dialogue with other disciplines as well. During our era, 3 of those other disciplines have been literature, other religions, and science. Any number of Baptists have contributed to the study of the relationship between literature and theology. I jotted down 3 names: Paul Fittis, John Killinger, and Ralph Wood. Some of you all know all or some of those. Harvey Cox wrote about the relationship between Christianity and other religions in his 1988 book, Many Mansions. He's a Baptist. Charles Kimball, also a Baptist, is an expert on Islam who once had the extraordinary experience of being asked by the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran to talk to him about Jesus. Mark Heim is a Baptist systematic theologian who teaches at Andover Newton and has written 3 books about other religions. The third is entitled The Depth of the Riches, a Trinitarian Theology of Religious Ends. It was published in 2001, and in it Ham makes several really striking proposals. He says that the claims of the world religions about salvation may all be true, even though those claims seem to be mutually exclusive, because the religions understand salvation so very differently. So Buddhists may be right that the Eightfold Noble Path leads to nirvana, and Christians may also be right that redemption leads to everlasting community with the Holy Trinity. In building bridges between theology and science, practicing scientists naturally enjoy special authority. At least 3 Baptists who are scientists have made important contributions to this field. Charles Towns received the Nobel Prize for work that led to lasers. There's a wonderful place in the interview that of Tonks with Duke McCall, in which Tonks asked Duke McCall, he says, "You were the valedictorian in your class at Furman, weren't you?" He said, "I was, but I wasn't the smartest guy in the class. The smartest guy was Charlie Towns." Towns had won the Nobel while Duke McCall was president at the seminary at Louisville. Sir John Houghton is co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which received a Nobel Prize for its work. He also is a Baptist lay preacher and the author of a book entitled The Search for God, Can Science Help? Francis Collins is a convert from agnosticism who successfully directed the largest scientific research project in human history, the Human Genome Project, and he is now the director of the National Institutes of Health. His book about science and theology is entitled The Language of God. The language of God is DNA. Eric Rust, an English Baptist, taught at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary at mid-century when Karl Barth was the dominant voice in Protestant theology. Barth's influence was so great that it discouraged other theologians from dealing with the relationship of science and theology. I haven't checked this out, but I read that in Barth's 1,000 pages about the doctrine of creation, there is not a single reference to science. Eric Rust rode against that current and wrote often and well about science and theology. Theologians have always advocated for Christian faith, but sometimes they also advocate for particular causes. Some Baptist theologians have written advocacy theologies as well. Deotis Roberts advocated for black theology in his 1971 book, Liberation and Reconciliation. Jan Aldrich Clanton advocates for feminist theology in her 1991 book, In Whose Image, God and Gender. Miguel de la Torre advocates for Hispanic moral theology in a 2010 book entitled Latino-Latina Social Ethics, Moving Beyond Eurocentric Thinking. He also is an adult convert and teaches now at the Aleph School in Denver and is currently president of the Society of Christian Ethics. Advocacy theologies and bridge theologies are valuable, I think, to the church and society, but they do carry a risk. The causes for which theologians advocate, or the disciplines to which they build bridges, can become more important to the theologians than God, and that, of course, is idolatry. Academic theology embraces several kinds of distinct disciplines, including biblical theology, philosophical, historical, moral, pastoral, and systematic. You might assume that biblical theology and historical theology are purely descriptive, so that a book about biblical theology would simply tell you what the Apostle Paul thought about justification or whatever. To some extent this is true, but for Baptists the situation is more complicated, especially as regards biblical theology, because Baptists are so serious about having the Bible as their holy book. When you describe the Bible's theological content to them, you are de facto prescribing that they take it seriously and incorporate it into their lives. Over the past 6 decades, Baptists did immense work in biblical theology. I think the 2 strongest fields, it seems to me, for Baptist academic work are biblical and historical theology, your field, and biblical. Out of that vast literature, I'll offer as an example one book which illustrates how Baptist biblical theology combines description with prescription. It's New Testament Theology by Frank Stagg, who taught at 2 of the Southern Baptist seminaries. He worked in the important tradition known as the Biblical Theology Movement, the most famous product of which is Gerhard Kettle's Theological Word Book of the New Testament. Stagg's book is organized like a traditional systematic theology, but its content is the product of careful biblical scholarship wedded to the author's passionate concern about social and personal morality. It's not only an account of New Testament teachings, it's a call to live in the way of Jesus. Here is Stagg writing about the doctrine of sanctification. You'll see how it is descriptive, but how very much it is prescriptive as well. Not to be evaded or explained away as Matthew 5:45 with its demand, "You shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." There are escapes through exegesis, but probably this verse is to be taken at face value. Does one expect Jesus to say, "Be 9/10 pure"? God never compromises his standard. It is perfection. Jesus demands absolute trust, obedience, love, loyalty. He gave his all, and he demands our all. The other side of this is that salvation is absolutely free, the gift of God's grace. The Christian lives in the tension of gift and demand. I love that passage because it just shows, it could be a sermon, and yet it's very good biblical scholarship, and it is very descriptive, and probably I take it a correct interpretation of what Jesus says there in that passage. Stagg also advocated for particular causes in his work. His concern for racial justice is evident in a groundbreaking commentary in which he argued persuasively that in Acts, the principal barriers that the church had to cross in its struggle for an unhindered gospel were racial rather than geographical. With his wife Evelyn, Stagg wrote a book entitled Woman in the World of Jesus, advocating for a change in women's role in the church and society. He also advocated for an end to the war in Vietnam, though he didn't write a book about that. Baptists have excelled in the academic discipline of church history, especially at interpreting their own history and theology. Nowhere is this clearer than your own publication. Baptist systematic theologians usually make use of historical theology in their work. During the past 6 decades, this was done, I think, in an especially impressive way in the 2-volume Systematic Theology by James Leo Garrett. My sense is that he has taken historical theology to a new level insofar as it's being used for systematic theology. Although many Baptists have been interested in the philosophy of religion, not many have written philosophical theologies. During our time, Langdon Gilkey was probably the most influential Baptist theologian who might have been described as a philosophical theologian. Kenneth Coffin is the author of a 1986 book entitled Systematic Theology. In this book and on his website, Coffin writes about God in a very philosophical manner. He holds an immanentist process view of God. God is the life of the world is the body of God. Coffin thinks that God is finite and therefore unable to rein in the evil of the world completely. He believes that God is suffering love, and that while in principle this truth is available everywhere for him and other Christians, it is seen most fully in Jesus. God's suffering love is evident both in the teachings of the earthly Jesus and in the apostolic kerygma, which emphasize his death and resurrection. These two, though often separated, should be kept together. Coffin describes himself as a pragmatist and a skeptic. He says that being a lifelong Baptist has supported him in thinking about things for himself. In the period we're considering, Baptists have written at length about social ethics or moral theology, including, among others, Henley Barnett, T.B. Maston, who was mentioned earlier, R.E.O. White, Dallas Willard, Anna Robbins, many others. It seems to me that a milestone in Baptist ethics may have been reached in 2003 with the publication of David Gushee and Glenn Stassen's 500-page Kingdom Ethics. Their method is hinted at in the subtitle, Following Jesus in Contemporary Context. They use Jesus' teaching, especially the Sermon on the Mount, as their principal criterion for making ethical judgments. This has been done in monographs written by other Baptists such as Tony Campolo, but as far as I'm aware, this is the first time it was done in a large textbook of Christian ethics. It seems to me appropriate to name as moral theologians also Baptists who have been influential in public life and have written about moral issues. Three who come immediately to mind are Martin Luther King Jr. on civil rights and on the war in Vietnam, Jimmy Carter on human rights, and Al Gore, who has been awarded the Nobel Prize for the work he has done in helping us reflect on the moral issues involved in global warming. And in the discipline of pastoral theology also, Baptists have done wonderful work. In that field, even today, more than a dozen years after his death, Wayne Oates remains a towering figure. I think it's wonderful that this man who wrote 57 books is the person who coined the word workaholic. Well, this morning our principal interest, of course, is systematic theology. Theology written in a somewhat orderly manner to commend certain traditional and or original theological ideas to readers. From now on, I'm going to use the word theology to refer to this. The walls between it and the other kinds of theology that I've mentioned, and some others, are porous, so the other kinds of theology routinely are incorporated into systematic theologies. The books tend to be of three kinds: introductions, which survey the doctrines, large systematic theologies that are supposed to be comprehensive, and monographs devoted usually to a single theme. By mediating between church members and the sometimes inaccessible writings of academic theologians, introductions and summaries of Christian theology contribute meaningfully to the lives of Christians who desire to understand their faith better. Out of many such books written in the past 6 decades, I'm going to mention just two, and I'm going to just say a word or two about why I chose these two. There are a lot of wonderful books like this, and I'm really a fan. I believe in this kind of a book. The two I chose are Dallas Rourke's book, The Christian Faith, An Introduction to Christian Thought. I chose it because Dallas Rourke did not teach at a Baptist school. He was teaching at Kansas State Teachers College when he wrote this book. And his opening 2 chapters give away that his audience is wider than people who are in a Baptist seminary or college. The first chapter is Why Believe in God, and the second chapter is, let me get the title just right here, the second title is Why Christianity All Religions. And then there is at least one really important, I think, proposal that he makes in this book. Original proposals in theology don't just come out in articles or monographs. He has an interesting proposal about atonement. The other one I chose is by Bruce Milne. Bruce Milne is a Scot who had taught at Spurgeon's College, but came as pastor of the First Baptist Church of Vancouver. And he wrote a book called Know the Truth. It's about 350 pages. As a pastor theologian, he was really skilled at communicating kind of introductory ideas about theology and so on. It's a really good book, and there are lots of things about it to commend it. But as I say, there are many such books. And then we Baptists have a special subcategory of introductions to theology, which are basically introductions to Baptist theology. There was a reference in one of the papers yesterday to Baptist principles. Also, they've been known as Baptist distinctives. Stan Norman has a book in which he has a bibliography and lists about 25 of these books of Baptist distinctives written during the time period since 1950. These are excellent books as well, very important. They do carry a risk, I think, focusing attention on the beliefs that set Baptists apart from other Christians can mislead inexperienced readers into thinking that these distinctively Baptist beliefs are actually more important than the beliefs that we hold in common with Christians. Now, I'm really for believers' baptism, but y'all, God's important too, and so we have to allow for that, make sure people don't misunderstand that. The second kind of books of systematic theology are the big textbooks, these huge books. These that I've got here are in the range of 12 to 14, 1,500 pages, and so on. I have in my notes here that the principal use that students make of them after graduation is as reference books, but it occurred to me on the way up here that they actually probably use them as doorstops as much as they do anything. I don't know that many people, Bart's 8 million word dogmatics. He actually said he hoped pastors sat in their studies reading that thing. And so maybe when they get to heaven, I don't know. But I think maybe not a busy American pastor anyway. I picked out these people for different reasons. R.T. Kendall is just such an interesting person. His 3 volumes is 1,400 pages. It is called Understanding Theology. Are you ready for this? It is all outlines. There's just an occasional paragraph, usually the summary, the concluding paragraph of that. 1,400 pages of outlines. It's amazing. And his career is amazing. He is a Southern Baptist who served for 25 years to the day as pastor of the Westminster Chapel in London. His predecessors were G. Campbell Morgan and David Martin Lloyd Jones. And like them, he's a great expositor. He also is a very devout Calvinist, and he also is charismatic, which that was new to me. I had somehow missed out on that. And then Wayne Grudem, one of the most influential of the current systematic theologies, I think. He is from the Baptist General Conference, and his book is being very widely used. Millard Erickson, I think, is a little bit more of a mediating theologian than these other two. In my comments about Erickson here, I have something about one of the places he tries to mediate is this question about predestination that's come up, I think, every day of this conference. My own sense is that there isn't a very viable mediating position on this, so I'll just offer that for what it's worth. If you believe that in eternity, without reference to God's knowledge of how any of us was going to behave, God elected a certain set of people to be saved, and then if there is anybody else, they didn't elect those, passed over anybody not in that set of people, then you're a Calvinist. And if you don't believe that, you're not a Calvinist. And we can talk about 3 points, 4 points, and all of the rest of it, but in the end, there is an either-or position. I'll just throw in one more thing for good measure. I think one of the most misleading phrases is the two phrases that were used for the two Baptist groups in England, general in particular, as though the issue were the extent of the atonement. The issue is predestination, and the extent of the atonement follows. What Dort says about limited atonement is an absolute logical implicate of what it says about predestination. Dort says the atonement of Christ is infinite in its value, but it only is intended by God to benefit the elect. Well, that's what you would have to say. So you can't really leave off limited atonement in the sense in which they presented it. Okay, so I dealt with that a little bit. I have Dale Moody because I just love Dale Moody and because I loved his book and what a fun person he was. I think this is the most biblical of all these books on this list of long. I estimate 3,000 references to Scripture. He is instinctively an ecumenist. Indeed, I wonder if anybody else has ever been this ecumenical. In his chapter on eschatology, he has one page in which he is dealing very carefully with Albert Schweitzer's thesis about in the quest of the historical Jesus. And the next page is dealing very carefully with C.I. Scofield's reference battle. Has anybody else ever been that ecumenical? It's a real achievement. His enthusiasm for the Bible is just as infectious as Leo Garrett's enthusiasm is for Christian history. And both of them have been great contributors to Baptist life, I think. And then I have Stanley Grenz. He represents a real change of tone in theology as much as he has in common with the others. And I chose as an illustration of that the fact that, unlike the others, his doctrine of Scripture does not appear at the first of the book. It appears over in the middle of the book in a chapter on the Spirit, where he talks about the ways in which the Spirit does the Spirit's work in the church, and one of those ways is by the use of Scripture. There you have the doctrine. In this, Grenz is following the first London Confession, and not the second. In the second London Confession, you start off with what Scripture is and so forth, but in the first London Confession, you don't. And I think I think it is actually a way forward in theology. And then I won't even attempt to say anything about this one because I want to finish up a little bit. But, in my judgment, James William Clendon's 3-volume systematic theology is the most original systematic theology ever written by any Baptist. I just offer that for you to consider. First of all, is the sequencing thing. usually get method, and then the doctrines, and then the ethical implications, and he simply flips the series around. You begin with the ethics, the theory. The idea is that we come into the church because of its life, and we learn its life and its doctrine the way people learn a first language, not a second and a third language. And when we're a part of things, we begin to reflect on things intentionally for ourselves. Then we need the book on doctrine. And when we've done that, then we need to know the witnesses, the warrants for why this community believes these things. The Witness is the third volume. So it is the most original. It's a very, very important book. It is the most widely discussed systematic theology by Baptists in my lifetime, and I think it deserves that. The first speakers I heard talking about Jim McClendon's book were Roman Catholics, and they were very, very impressed. Okay, and then the third kind of books in systematic theology are monographs, books that deal with one topic. I'll just do one or two of these, and then I'm going to stop because I said I'd stop at about a half hour, and then we'll just do whatever you want to for the rest of the time, which includes leaving and going over that thing at 11 o'clock if you want to. So, the first book I've chosen is Frank Tupper's book, A Scandalous Providence. 1968, Fortress Press published Jesus, God, and Man by a German Lutheran theologian, Wolfhard Pannenberg. Pannenberg famously put the issue of Jesus' resurrection as a historical event in the life of Jesus back on the table for theologians. Now, this is not a fundamentalist. He reads the accounts of the virgin births. He says there's no historical evidence there. It probably didn't happen. He's no fundamentalist. But he reads the accounts of the resurrection, and he says this happened in history. And it's not an experience in the life of the disciples only. It's an experience in the life of Jesus. He was raised from the dead. That put the thing on, but this was pretty startling to people. It's a very important book. Well, a young Baptist, this was in 1968, a young Baptist theologian, Frank Tupper, spent that same year, 1968, studying with Pannenberg at Munich because of Frank Tupper's interest in the resurrection of Jesus. Tupper's the author of A Scandalous Providence, the Jesus Story of the Compassion of God, published in 1991. This is a book in which he has responded to an enormous amount of literature, as you can see from the footnotes and the content. But Tupper wrestles with life as much as with literature. In 1981, his wife Betty learned that she had cancer, and she died in 1983. Early in his book, Tupper briefly describes her ordeal, and then at the end of the book, he records conversations that the two of them had in the weeks leading up to her death. I found these accounts deeply moving. I cannot imagine anyone who would not. There's not any self-pity. There's not any pretending about anything. It's wonderful. Tupper defines God's providence as the loving care of God in relationship to creation, history, and each of our lives. For him, providence is literally a life and death issue. He writes extended theological meditations on stories about Jesus from his birth to his death and resurrection. This is the structure of the book. The chapters go by these different stories of Jesus. He also reflects on the stories of contemporary persons, some famous and others not. This is narrative theology at its best, not using stories to illustrate concepts or even to inspire the reader, but mining the stories for their theological and religious meaning. Tupper's principal thesis is that God always does the best God can do, given the limitations of any situation. He doesn't mean that the universe limits God, though he considers that idea. And there's a passage, there are one or two passages where he almost seems to embrace that. But most of the time he says that God has voluntarily accepted limitations as part of creating the kind of world which we live. Tupper doesn't attempt to describe those limitations, which is interesting. It's such an important part of his thesis, you'd think he would. But he seems to make the assumption that we know from our experience the kinds of limitations that God has, because we know the kinds of things this loving God would have done had God not experienced those limitations. He writes forcefully about the historical resurrection of Jesus and the reality of the future resurrection of the dead. And in this we see similarities to that of theology of his mentor, Pannenberg. The next one I have is Clark Pinnock's book, Flame of Love, published in 1996. The subtitle is The Theology of the Holy Spirit. This is the most beautiful book of theology I can ever remember reading. Pinnock believes that God is not only good, wise, and powerful, but also beautiful. The beauty of the God of love shines out in the book. Pinnock writes that the triune God is not at all like Aristotle's God, thinking only about thinking. God is pure ecstasy. Each person exists in loving relationship with the other persons, and the joyous fellowship spills over into giving life to the creature. Theology ought to be beautiful because its subject is so beautiful, he writes. The Trinity is an open, inviting fellowship, and the Spirit wants the church to be the same. If I'd ever written a sentence that good, I would be real proud. We know that God, lover of humanity, desires all to be saved. When we look at salvation from the standpoint of the Spirit, we view it in relational, affective terms. These are all quotations. Being saved is like falling in love with God. Pinnock writes about salvation as union with God, beatific vision, communion, and theosis, divinization, more than as acquittal in a courtroom. Of the possibility that people who are not Christians may be saved, Pinnock writes, and I'm quoting, there is no way around it. We must hope that God's gift of salvation is being applied to people everywhere. Let us not forget to hope. We are good news people. Negativity does not become us. Pinnock takes seriously the challenge that in this hope he may be motivated by wishful thinking, which I really appreciate. That is a possibility. And then he turns the tables and asks those who disagree with him to consider their own motives. What was Jonah's motive for resenting the fact that God was showing mercy to Nineveh? What was the elder son's motive in resenting the welcome which his father gave when the prodigal son came home? Pinnock concludes, let us never give up hope for those who have not yet believed. Pinnock believes that the Spirit has a cosmic role. He advocates for a Spirit Christology in our time, but he is thinking of the Spirit as the third person of the Trinity, not simply as the divine in Jesus. He emphasizes the presence of the Spirit in the sacraments. He explains why the charismatic renewal has meant so much to him and to millions of others. He says that God's mission includes not just saving souls, but peace and justice and the renewing of the whole world. Okay, that's about 30 minutes or so, and we have about, by my watch, 35 minutes till 11:15, if we make it that long. And I'd be glad to look at any of the others. On some of them, I can just talk to you about them. On some of them, I'll have to go to them and read them, depending on if you want to look at anything else that's there on the outline, or we can talk about just what I've read, any of what I've just talked about. So, you set the agenda.
What is this untamed hospitality by Elizabeth Newman? What is she?
That's one of the ones that I would want to read. It's about 2 minutes, I think. It may be, no, I think, let me see. Let me see if I can do it. I'll read a little fast. Her book was published in 2007. She conducts a running campaign against distortions of Christian hospitality. It's not about being nice. It's not something you do as an individual. It's not trivial. When Christians worship, they experience God's hospitality. In corporate worship, they are trained to practice Christian hospitality. Christians need to see through the lies that modernity tells us. People don't become who they were meant to be by competing and winning. That's a lie. Science is not the only way to know reality. That's another lie. Faith is a way of knowing. Scientists have faith as much as religious people do, and they are rooted in a tradition as much as religious people are. Liberal democracy does not seek the common good, but rather frees individuals to compete and therefore pursue their individual goods. It is therefore complicit in an ontology of competition and violence. In all education, there must be catechesis before there can be genuine debate. For Christians, the end of education must be the love of the triune God. That is enough for 7 controversies right there. As the church enters postmodernity, the greatest contribution it can make is simply to be the church. When Christians gather to worship, they participate most fully in the triune God of hospitality. It is emotionalism and rationalism to hope that real worship will occur if only individuals will conjure up the right feelings or thoughts. The churches don't have to be unified in order to share the Eucharist. They share the Eucharist in order to become unified. The disunity of the church is a wound on the body of Christ. Newman says there are no easy solutions to the church's problems. Christians must work together corporately to be faithful in small things. She gives us examples of communities doing this: the L'Arche community that works with persons with mental challenges, and the Church of the Savior. They know how to be with people, not just do things for people. One of her, a great sentence, I think, is this one: "The church is not ours, but God's. We are therefore free from the seduction of trying to save the church and the world." Another one: "Hospitality is not something we accomplish, but a life we are given as we grow in dependence upon God and one another." So those are some of the things she says. It's a really fine book. On a topic I have not read a book before. Somewhere out there's some booster club or chamber of commerce that's bought 100 copies of this, thinking we'll show hospitality in our town and get a lot of tourists or something. So I hope they read it. Sorry. Oh, yes. Kurt.
Sure. Thank you for this. This is wonderful. I wonder if you could talk about Willie Jennings' book, what you thought about that.
Yes,
I read a lot of it.
I have to, Chris, I can hardly even, and this is one really, really smart guy. And I just have, if I don't read this, I won't get it anywhere near right. I may not have it right here, but it's short. So can I do that and then we talk about it? And you know him, so I work with him, so you may can help me on this. This is the way I've tried to put it. Colonialism and slavery have been variously interpreted. In his 2009 book, The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race, Willie James Jennings offers an interpretation that is theological. He teaches theology at Duke and was formerly the academic dean there. He was dean when you got there, wasn't he? He describes how slavery separated peoples from the families, cultures, languages, and lands which had made them peoples. Deprived of these things, they ceased to be peoples. The only identity that remained for them was their bodies. That is a racial identity. Colonialism thereby constructed race. In the place of peoples, colonialism constructed nations. On the racial scale created by colonialism, white was the norm. Whites assessed all others in terms of how closely they approximated that. Colonialism segregated people and slavery commodified them. Their value was understood in terms of their utility as workers. The colonizers were Christians. This is the heartbreaking thing. And Christian theology colluded with what they were doing. It had adopted, and this is, I think, a truly original thesis, a supersessionist interpretation of Israel, that God had replaced Israel with the church rather than grafted the church onto Israel. Colonizers interpreted their victims as having lost God in the same way. This made Christianity susceptible to the racial interpretation of people. It was an inversion of the Christian message of the incarnation of the Son of God who came as a Jew in the land of Israel. Jennings is a realist about the racial scale. He writes, "The elimination of race is beside the point. The world has been changed and the earth has been taken from us. So we're not going to get rid of it. So how do you then live with it when it stays? If the church can't eliminate it, then what's the way forward?" He says that it's a renewal of the Christian imagination, bearing in mind that God created place and peoples, and that colonialism replaced these with race and nation. The church must try to imagine together what real Christian community and intimacy might look like. And I will leave off the last paragraph, but the structure of the book is that 4 of the chapters are given principally to telling a long, detailed telling of stories of 4 people. The first one is a court reporter who had attended a slave auction in 1444 in Lagos, in what is now Nigeria. And then the others are also from the past. Then he relates to all kinds of other people, and of course to all kinds of thinking about colonialism and slavery generally, and so on. It's an absolutely brilliant book. The way I've written at the last sentence, this is a passionate book by a brilliant theologian about a topic to which he says theologians have not given enough attention. He convinced me that that's true. But Curtis, you know him so well. What other things seem outstanding to you about that book?
I think the last quote that you had about that theology has universalized Jesus and so defaced his Jewishness, and this has been the basis of racializing theology.
Yeah.
But he does that as a Black Baptist, that if you get that little introduction story that he tells, it sort of is what this grows out.
Yes, yes. You know, I I hadn't linked these before, but you're sitting right next to Philip, so I immediately thought, Philip, you made a proposal about the First London Confession, did you not? The Second London Confession. Has that been published? That it bypasses a supersessionist understanding of Israel, doesn't it? Can you say anything more about that? Or?
Well, what you have in Puritan England, 17th century, is you have what's called supersessionism, as Fisher said, is this idea that churches replace Judaism. In fact, in Orchard's book that Bill quoted last night, Orchard has this just horrible sentence about how the council in Jerusalem in Acts 15 revoked the covenant between God and Israel, said that it left them without a hope and a promise. And so the church, meaning Baptists or Orchard, then becomes the new Israel. So anyway, that's supersessionism in a nutshell. And it leads to what you call an adversus Judaeos theology, which means a theology against the Jews, which calls the Jews Christ killers, and you find so many horrible examples of that throughout the church's history. In the Puritan age, which you also find in other times of the Reformation, you have what's called a kind of philo-Semitism, which is loving the Jews because you figure, well, we've got the church right, so now they're going to come to Jesus and join us, and then when they don't, then it sort of turns against them. Well, you find this philo-Semitism among the other Puritan bodies, but in the Baptists, to my understanding, the Baptists alone you just don't find the same degree of supersessionist theology that you find along with that philo-Semitism in other Puritan bodies. And so Clark Williamson, in his post-Shoah theology, Guest in the House of Israel, goes through some historic documents, and there's one from the Westminster Confession that he just really comes down hard. Fisher, forgive me, I haven't read this in a long time, so I can't remember exactly where it is. So I always like to compare what the Baptists were saying, but since the Second London Confession is pretty much a Baptist version of Westminster. And I went, and they just eliminated those arguments. And then also, one of the interesting moves that the Westminster does with the covenant, the Baptists don't do that. They have the covenant of grace is from Abraham all the way through, or actually from Adam. They extend it back to Adam. The promise to Adam is the beginning of the covenant of grace, which the other Reformed bodies start with Abraham. And so you get these really interesting things, and then you have Thomas Grantham in his St. Paul's Catechism, just this remarkable question, and talk about other religions. It's a strange catechism because the child asks the questions and the adult gives the answers. And so they're talking about the mediator, Jesus Christ, and there's also some really fascinating things about the church, but I'll leave that aside. But the child asks, what about those who do not know or hear the gospel? And the father responds, those who do not know the mediator must yet have life by his name. All who know God as one who does exercise justice, loving kindness and mercy in the world, do know the mediator virtually, believing on him as such, do know him savingly. And then the child says, well, I see it as not good for us to pride up ourselves against the nations which have not the gospel as we have. Here's something that is remarkable.
Yeah, it is interesting.
But that statement about God as one who exercises justice, loving kindness, and mercy comes from Moses Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, which is a medieval Jewish text. So apparently Grantham must have had some knowledge of Maimonides.
Yeah.
He read a lot while he was in prison.
That's amazing. Well,
anyway, so you just find some really, the Baptists weren't completely consistent. There are other things like the Orthodox Creed talks about the two covenants hold out salvation to them and to us, meaning the two branches of the one people of God.
I hope you're going to write this up.
Well,
This thing, but to me, it's just brilliant what James has done is to pull that whole.
Yeah.
And he doesn't refer to any of the things Philip has talked about, except supersessionism in the abstract. But he sees that as contributing to this whole construction of race once the European nations began to be colonizers. And it's an absolutely brilliant idea. Who can think of these things? I don't know, but I'm glad some people do. So, well, somebody, yes. How many you want? They're really short. You can have them all if you want. I'd be glad to see what you think about this. First one, the content is going to remain very diverse. Pretty safe there, I think. Second, these are predictions about what our theology might be like in the future. Baptist theologians will probably be writing more because we're doing so much more now than we were 60 years ago. Third, we'll continue to make creative proposals. I can hardly think of any from the early part of this period in the 1950s. I mean, we were reformatting the knowledge that was out there, so to speak, but there's an awful lot of it now. Fourth, more women will be writing theology. We're certainly, I don't know, systematic theology has not been an area where women have been great contributors at this point. Biblical, historical theology, again, has been, but that's where Baptists are strongest generally. But I hope there will be lots more. Fifth, we'll be writing in languages other than English. We had enough of a mission. We started among English-speaking people. Our numbers are predominantly in English-speaking languages today, by a long way. Nevertheless, we've had a lot of missionary work, and there ought to be more. There is a good bit right now. I mentioned Miguel de la Torre. He is from Cuba and does some of his writing in Spanish, but he is now an American citizen and teaches at Aleph and writes in English as well. But there are many others. In the book that Curtis and others edited, there are several who write in languages other than English. Sixth, we'll continue to treat the Bible as in some sense authoritative for theology. There's no signs that stops. Not with Kenneth Coffin. Now, I did have, the Death of God movement, which I didn't get to, one of the leaders was the Baptist, William Hamilton. And I would say maybe you could say for Hamilton the Bible wasn't terribly authoritative since he thought God had died. But it's still the way we operate. Whether there will be more as a result of the change in the biggest group, the Southern Baptist Convention, with a official commitment to inerrancy, whether there will be more writing from the point of view of inerrancy or not, I don't know. I would suspect so. Seventh, we'll continue to engage historical theology. Eighth, we'll continue to engage in conversations with other religions more than in the past. This is happening, and if nothing else, 9/11 is forcing it on us. Ninth, we'll continue to incorporate social ethics. 10th, continue to advocate for causes, especially for injustices arising from issues of gender, race, class, ecology, and war. That was all reflected in this conference this week. 11th, we'll continue, in my judgment, more and more Baptists are likely to adopt a sacramental understanding of the Lord's Supper, or both the sacraments. I did not get to that in the presentation here, but it seems to me that's probably the trend. 12th, Baptists will continue to wrestle with standing issues of modernity. You can make a claim that the issues are all new now in a postmodern world, but my sense is that we're not going to, science empowers technology, and Peter Berger says we have no record of any society rejecting technologies that would help them in their lives. So science is with us. It's going to be, we've got to keep responding to that, and we're doing it better and better. And then I think also on human rights. Whatever we say about it, it's a way of secular or non-Christian people saying something like what we Christians and Jews say by saying human beings were created by God in the image of God and are therefore of great value, and so forth. So I think the modern issues are going to stay with us. 13th, we will in fact wrestle with new issues arising from the fact that the world is becoming less modern and more a postmodern world. In particular, when a theologian's program is basically to dump as much stuff that hints of supernaturalism as possible in order to make the message as attractive as possible to people who are skeptical about the supernatural, I think I think there will be less of that. And I'm not thinking of any particular Baptist, certainly not of anyone that I've named here. But at the risk of sounding rude, I do think that is Bishop Shelby Spong's program. I mean, I think basically if you're sort of secular and don't believe in anything much supernatural, he's going to try to whittle Christianity down to where you can embrace it. I don't see any future for that kind of theology. I think that's in my judgment. 14th, we're going to continue to write about the Trinity and more and more, and this is good. The death of God movement, one of the nice things that happened was, theologians have been writing about Jesus and about the church. They didn't write about God very much. 1970, I proposed to a friend that we teach a course together. He was a New Testament person on the doctrine of God in our seminary. He said, that's not an issue in New Testament studies. And it was one of the Scandinavians, Christopher Stendahl or somebody, who has this wonderful essay. Somebody don't know who this was. Give me the right name. The Neglected Factor in New Testament Theology. Who wrote that? It was in that Yale thing they send out to, this thing gets around. It's really good. It wasn't Stendahl, it was a Scandinavian New Testament stuff. The Neglected Factor was God. The only book about God in the New Testament teaching about God for years that I was able to find was actually about Baptist. A man who taught at Regents Park College, whose name I haven't thought of. I should have had him in this list. I have 252 people on the list, and I've found 3 more since I got here this week. Cornell West, I just forgot. I just didn't. So anyway, the doctrine of the Trinity, I think that's good. We'll continue to debate the standing issues that are unresolved, like Calvinism. We'll continue to debate issues that emerge from new movements. During the 20th century, 2 of those movements were Pentecostalism and ecumenism. And both of them raise new sets of concerns for us. So I think that is likely to happen in the next 50 or 100 years as well. Though what those things are, who knows? And then the last one, I think it's unlikely, but it is possible. We might actually develop schools of theology. The Germans do this. You got all the Bultmannians and whatnot. And the English never do it. They don't do that. And the Americans haven't traditionally done it. But, I mentioned I listed some possible candidates during our period, Harvey Cox and Langdon Gilkey and Millard Erickson and Clark Pennock and Paul Fittis, but it hadn't happened with any of those. But it has kind of happened a little bit with McClendon, and deservedly so, I think. Nothing like the Germans, but something. So we might have that. That could be interesting. Okay, I gave them all to you, Sherry. Oh, I'd be glad to. Nice thing I got them numbered. Continue to advocate for causes. Yeah. I put my email address on the bottom there, on the outline. And if you'll send me a note, I can send this to you. Just drop me a message, I'll send it to you. And it's going to be published, but Bruce, who is my dear friend, will only give me 4,000 words, and it's something in the neighborhood of 16,000 right now. So if you want the whole thing, and this is no footnotes. I got to add the footnotes. So anyway, Sherry, I'll send it to you. I can send it to you if you want it, any of you. Okay, we still have a few minutes. Other things you think about?
Fisher, you mentioned theologian and Trinity. Molly Marshall, has some writing on the Trinity and the Spirit.
She does. She has a blog or something.
Trinitarian Soundings.
That's it. Trinitarian Soundings is what she calls it. And then she has a book on the Holy Spirit called Join the Dance. And although it's on the Spirit, and this is very similar to Clark Pennock's book, which I did read for you a minute ago, she begins with an awful lot of stuff about the Trinity. And it's very interesting. And so she's an enthusiast. She very much is. Now, that's another book. Y'all, this was so hard to decide. I have 6 of these monographs. And there were so many. Molly's book on the Spirit, I could have done that very well. Warren McWilliams at OBU, Warren's got 3 books on suffering and faith. I finally decided to do Frank Tupper's book, but there's so many. It's just the way it is. You can't do them all. But anyway, yes, thank you, Bill. And she has also a good book on what it means to be human. In fact, that's the title of it. Now that I think about it, and it's very good. It's a little more popular level than the book on the Spirit. Both of them very readable and so forth, but it really is. I think you could very easily give it to undergraduates. So, yes, please.
I was in an AAR meeting about 6 or 7 years ago, and I think it might have been systematic theology section. We were talking about in the postmodern era a real downturn in the writing of systematics. I was wondering if you ever saw Baptist see that starting to tail off for us too, more of an emphasis on these kind of issues you've talked about, monographs here and there, and not so much the grand synthesis. What's your thought on that?
I don't know if we're deep enough into it to know, but I would certainly think that in a real sense, McClendon's book is kind of it's a post-liberal or a postmodern book, whatever. And so I think, and then I think in some sense Stanley Green's book is. So I think the answer I would probably give is his book is called Theology for the Community of God. So no, I don't think I said that. It could be that it's happening. The really interesting thing to me is, our first great systematic theologian was John Gill, and he was a pastor, 50-something years in one church, and in London, and so you've got the heritage of doing these big systematic, but the English don't seem to do that now. Do y'all know? And maybe there's one I just don't know about. A big old systematic like that by an English person since 1950. I don't know of one. And even introductions they don't do. So the real interesting thing to me is not that we did it more earlier and they're going to do fewer in the postmodern world. It's more we do it more over here and they don't do it much over in England. And I don't know how to explain that exactly. It may have to do with the way things are taught over there at Oxford and places like that. I just don't know. I would think that it almost might be the opposite, Jay, that it could be a kind of a spur to people to say, okay, let's think it all through and let's do a rounded view. I guess you get charged with giving a meta-narrative, which is now not that, people question that, but give a comprehensive thing as much as you can. I would think that's certainly what happened with McClendon. So, but that's a great question. I hadn't thought about it. Harold? Oh, alas, oh dear. Make it 253rd. I filled in for him when he was on a sabbatical one time. Tell me about the book. I know nothing. I don't know about it.
I have a copy.
With you here? Oh, at home? Oh, okay. Well, I will just make. I'm going to go through all of this, so I'll have a look. Is it like a survey, or do you remember offhand? Kind of a survey?
Yeah.
Oh.
He leads out pneumatology, but I don't hold it against him as a Baptist.
Life Together.
Life Together. That's a title with good heritage, isn't it? Isn't that Bonhoeffer? Good. Thank you. I'm sorry I did not know about that. So, yes.
One thing that we also need to be aware of is Chris Ellis over in England wrote the first free church liturgical theology. And so to have a liturgical theology is a very important voice in this conversation. Chris has done a really good job in articulating the kind of depth structures of free church worship, because most liturgical theology comes out of those traditions that have long established rubrics for worship. And so Chris does great. The book is called Gathering. The Theology and Spirituality of Worship in the Free Church Tradition, SCM Press.
Is he the principal at Regent's Park?
No, his brother is.
That's his brother.
Yeah. Chris is back.
Oh, is he? Good, thank you. I had a note about some things he had written, and I think I ended up reading an article or two, but I had not heard of this book, so it's embarrassing, but anyway. Yes?
One other nominee in terms of spirit Christology, you mentioned that there is an emerging New Zealand Baptist theologian named Nick Hopkins. Nick is spelled N-Y-K, Hopkins, H-A-B-E-T-S. And he's just recently published his big book on spirit Christology, English publication.
Really?
Series of books. I don't recall the main title, but the subtitle is A Trinitarian Spirit Christology.
Let me say something very quickly that, thank you very much, Steve, that might be helpful, and it may be familiar to everybody, but on the chance that it's not. Often when we say spirit Christology, this is what we mean. We're not going to be Trinitarian. We're going to talk about Jesus as a man, but we can speak of Jesus as divine, but what we mean about Jesus as divine is simply the Spirit of God was with him in a special way, something like that. And so spirit Christology has that phrase, spirituality, has traditionally represented a declension from the traditional teaching about the Trinity and the Incarnation. The most famous book, I suppose, is the one by Jeffrey Lamb about that. And but in fact, what you get with Clark Pinnock and with this person whose name I've not heard till today is a traditional understanding of Trinity and Incarnation, the two great teachings of the Universal Church, and put together with the fact that a part of our understanding of how Jesus is divine can be in terms of spirit. So that represents something new. Yes, Rob?
Fisher, you mentioned the dialogue with other religions.
Uh-huh.
I've spent considerable time with congregations over the last 6 years. One of the concerns that I really have for us from the standpoint of theology is this inadequate theology of otherness and difference.
Mm-hmm.
And how we live the Christ life out in the context of increasing diversity.
Uh-huh.
And I'm really hoping in the future we see some attention given to this, at least openness and engagement on the part of the congregation with this otherness.
Yeah. Could I just respond in a couple of ways to that? First of all, I completely share your view, and I would start myself. I need to know more about this. I've never been in a dialogue with a person who was not a Christian. I mean, I've had lunch with people, but who's in another religion. But and that would be good for me. So I'm really very much a beginner on this myself. But I share your view that it is important, and it's becoming more important as time goes along. The second thing is, my experience has been that when I try to bring this up in churches, people don't like it. They don't want to hear about it. I lead a discussion at this Episcopal church that Delane mentioned in the introduction, and I've done this, 4 years now, 36 times I've had this discussion now, once a month, 9 months for 4 years, and they have stayed on the topic of the discussion 35 times. The one time that they did not was I talked about Christianity and its relationship to other religions. They did not want to talk about it, and they came back to just ending up talking about some aspects of Christianity. So so getting it done is going to be an interesting project, I would say. That's the second thing. The third thing that occurs to me is this book for us, for those of us who might try to lead churches in doing this book by Mark Ham. I only gave you a little bit about it, that extraordinary proposal, not totally original with him, but an additional proposal is that he takes very seriously the traditional view of the Trinity. And he says that the Trinity, that in the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity, there are a number of components. And that what is happening, for example, with the talk about nirvana or moksha or these other things in these other religions is a part of the reality of God. In other words, they are in touch with something. Let me give you one of the ways he puts it. He talks about how relationships between two people can be of 3 different types. One is a totally impersonal type. I donate my blood, the blood is given to you. There's no real personal relationship between us, but there's a real connection, a life connection actually, when in the case of a blood donation. Okay. Then there's a relationship where one person is entirely personal, active, intentional, conscious, and the other person is entirely passive and a recipient. And then there's a relationship of real community and communion where we are together, it's mutual, and so forth. Those 3 kinds of relationship, and he says those 3 kinds of relationship, and this is the part that gets tricky. I wouldn't want to try to tease this out. But he says there's something like that within the Trinity, but there's always permanently the full communion of the 3 persons. He says what happens is in these other religions, you get a part of something that is in the eternal life of God, but not all of it. And he thinks that what you get with the Christian understanding of salvation as being in the family of God is in fact the whole thing. So he says there's a sense in which A person who arrives at nirvana has missed out on some things, in that sense is not fully saved, but in another sense has connected with God in some sense. I would just say there's an awful lot to think about that. Does any of y'all know him? I've never heard him. Can you, anything you want to tell us about him?
Well, I don't really know him that well.
Uh-huh.
I know his wife much better, because we served together on the American Baptist+History.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I talked to him a few times.
Uh-huh.
I'm a historian, not a theologian.
Yeah.
So we didn't discuss theological issues very much.
Uh-huh.
But he's a very deep thing.
He is, and he's a good writer. And this is a very, I'm sure, it's the second half of the book where he talks about this in terms of the Trinity, that it is in fact the really original proposal. And he is not, you're not going to say wishful thinking for him. He talks about salvation as, he's talking about 4 places you can be in, and he's talking about eschatological, after we die. One place is in communion with God. A second place is you have really, through your other religion, accessed some aspect of God, but not the whole thing. But that is good. That is a good thing. And then there is the third, where there is a kind of it's hell, where you have resisted some of these things about God, and so on. And then there is a fourth one of people who are just contemptuous of life and so on, and that's hell in the full sense. I mean, it's a very daring book, and it's a lot to think about. And Rob, I would think, if I were trying to do something like that with a church, I would go back and read this book again real carefully and make a lot more notes than I did the first time, and let that would be for me. I wouldn't hand this to a Sunday school class, I don't think, but it would be good for me to just have something myself to see where I was working from. There's just there are good things out there, and Kimball is very good. He has a book about good and bad religion. Charles Kimball does, and
there's also a great book, if you haven't read it, by Darrell Cooter, The Continuing Conversion of the Church, that gets at this notion that when we come into conversation with persons of other faiths, we must be open to conversion.
Yeah.
And we come at it from the notion that God is speaking to us, then through conversation and change can happen. And for us, it's a great book.
I think there's some truth in it. I think the hardest thing for most people to see up front is whether it's really possible to both be a witness to your own faith and to the Lord. And on one hand, and in genuine dialogue becoming genuine when you are open to being changed by the dialogue, not just sending, but open to receiving something meaningful, and not just some trivial truth either. And I think the answer is it is possible. And honestly, I don't know how to provide a theological statement of how it's possible. The reason I know it's possible, I've seen it done. I've seen people who do both of these, and they're equally sincere. They're truly listening to others, and they are truly giving the gospel to others as well. And that's the best kind of dialogue at all. And y'all, this has been a good dialogue, and our time is up. And so thank you very much. I'm not in a hurry to leave myself, but I think it's time for us to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, this has been a wonderful meeting. Let me give you a closing note. Bruce, thank you so much. Let's thank Bruce for all that he's done. And I hope to see you all and some more in Richmond on May 20th, 2013. Thank you very much.
Thank you for what you said, Bill. I appreciate that.